Imagine a man who had it all: wealth, power, reputation. And yet, blinded by pride, he drove away the very woman who had given him life, his own mother. That night, in the pouring rain, she fell to her knees and cursed him. From that moment on, everything he had built began. Before we start, leave a comment and indicate which city you are sharing from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. The night it happened, the rain fell as if the sky itself wanted to drown the earth. I remember the sound against the glass walls of my estate, a steady drumbeat, muffling the world outside. I should have felt safe, wrapped in wealth, hidden in a mansion that towered like a monument to my success. Instead, when the intercom buzzed, announcing an unexpected guest at the gate, irritation spread through me like fire. My wife Sophia was the first to peer out, her eyes narrowing at the trembling figure in the storm. She didn't recognize her or pretended not to, but I knew immediately who it was. My mother, Olivia, 70 years old, fragile bones beneath a soaked gray dress, clutching nothing but her cane and a paper bag that sagged with rain. She had walked miles, it seemed, just to reach me. Sophia's lips curled with disdain. "She looks like a beggar," she hissed, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Maxwell, tell security to send her away. This is not the image we want for our home. She will humiliate us in front of the neighbors." I stood silent for too long. My mother raised her hand, as if she could see me through the storm, though she was blinded by the downpour. Her lips moved, and even from the balcony I thought I could hear her whisper my name. I wanted to go down, to help her, but pride, poisoned by Sophia's presence at my side, stiffened my spine. When she reached the steps, Sophia stormed outside with an umbrella, not to protect but to command. "You have no place here," she spat. "You raised your son for poverty, not for power. Leave before he is forced to say the words himself." I descended then, slow, deliberate, and for one unbearable moment my mother's eyes lit with hope. She stretched out her trembling arms, the way she once did when I was a boy coming home from school. But I didn't embrace her. I didn't even reach for her hand. I stood beside Sophia and said, with the coldness of a man who had forgotten his own blood, "Mother, you shouldn't be here. Go home. This is not your world anymore." The words shattered her. She staggered, dropped the paper bag, and oranges rolled across the wet stone like small suns extinguished by rain. Then, before my guards or Sophia could drive her away, she fell to her knees. Her cane clattered. Her voice rose, not in anger, but in a prayer that sliced through the storm. "Lord," she cried, her hands lifted to the sky, "if the child I bore and raised with my own hands has forgotten me, then let his gold turn to dust, his name to shame, his house to ruin. Let him learn what it means to be poor again, so he remembers the mother who carried him through the fire." Her words froze me where I stood. I wanted to stop her, but shame sealed my mouth. Sophia tugged my arm, whispering triumph, but all I felt was a chill deeper than the storm itself. My mother rose slowly, her body shaking, and walked away into the rain, vanishing into the night like a shadow swallowed by water. I never saw her again after that night, at least not until the curse began to work. And that was only the beginning. When I think back now, after everything, the memory of my childhood is painted not with bright colors but with shades of gray, hunger, and endless sacrifice. My father died before I even understood what the word loss meant. A mining accident, quick and merciless, left my mother alone with me in her arms and nothing in her pockets. People came to our small house that week, whispering condolences, leaving bread, leaving pity. But when the days stretched into months, no one returned. It was just her and me. She worked 3 jobs, though I only learned later how she managed it without sleep. At dawn she would scrub the floors of the town school, her knees raw, her hands cracked by icy water. By noon she stood in the fields, picking vegetables for wages so small they barely filled a sack. At night she sewed for neighbors by candlelight, her eyes swollen but determined. And in all of this, she never once allowed me to feel like a burden. When I cried for shoes, she gave me her own sandals. When I begged for meat, she starved herself so I could eat. I hated the sight of her thin wrists, her hollow cheeks, yet she always smiled, as if my well-being was worth every drop of blood she lost in exhaustion. There was a piece of land, just a sliver of soil by the river, that my father had left behind. It was all we owned. My mother sold it when I turned 15, tears running silently down her face as she signed the papers. That land was the last memory of him, the last tie to a man she once loved, but she let it go so I could go to school in the city. She told me education was the only inheritance she could afford to give me. I promised her I would repay her 1,000 times. I promised her she would never work again once I succeeded. Years later, when my first business deal brought me enough profit to breathe without fear, I returned to her with a key. Not to a mansion, but to a small house with solid walls, a real roof, a garden that caught the morning sun. I placed it in her hand with trembling pride. She cried, not for the house, but because she said I had already given her everything, the proof that her sacrifices were not in vain. That day she kissed my forehead and called me her miracle. And for a time I believed her. But success is a strange poison. First, it tastes like salvation. I rose quickly, faster than anyone expected, and each step upward was a step away from the life of poverty we had known. My mother stood by quietly, never asking for more, never reminding me of the nights she went hungry. Yet with every victory, every dollar, I called her less. I visited less. I convinced myself she didn't need me hovering over her. And still she prayed for me every morning. I know it because she always did. I remember her voice once when I visited after too long. Maxwell, don't forget who you are, she said gently. I laughed it off. I told her the world was too big now, that she should enjoy her comfort and leave the battles to me. I didn't see the pain behind her smile. I didn't see that she was afraid, not of losing me to death or disaster, but of losing me to pride. And she was right to be afraid, because pride has teeth sharper than hunger. And it was waiting for me in the form of Sophia, the woman who would widen the distance between us. I met Sophia at a charity gala, one of those events where diamonds glitter brighter than the stars and conversations weigh more in dollars than in words. She was unlike the women I had known before, graceful, sharp-eyed, carrying herself with the kind of confidence that only comes from a lifetime of wealth. When she spoke to me, she didn't ask about my past, didn't care for the struggle that shaped me. She only wanted to know my plans for the future. How big, how bold, how unstoppable I was prepared to become. And I, intoxicated by ambition, gave her the answers she wanted. She became my companion, my partner, and eventually my wife. With her by my side, my rise felt inevitable. Investors trusted me more because she came from an old and respected family. She knew which circles to enter, which doors to open, which people to flatter. I told myself it was love, but in truth it was also strategy. I wanted to belong to her world, a world where poverty was just a word in history books, not a shadow that followed you at night. First, my mother welcomed her. Olivia tried to see Sophia as the woman who would bring me happiness. But Sophia's smiles at her were thin, her words polite but edged with distance. I noticed it, yet chose to ignore it. When my mother called me in the evenings, Sophia would wave me off with a sigh, whispering that I needed to rest or focus on business. I listened to her, convincing myself that there would always be time for another call, another visit. The changes were subtle. 1 month passed without me going to the small house I had once bought with pride. Then 3. Then almost a year. My mother never complained, but I could hear the quiet longing in her voice when she asked about my health, my work, my life. She never asked for money, never demanded my presence, just simple closeness. And yet, even that I began to withhold. Sophia's influence grew deeper. She surrounded me with people who measured worth only by status and power. She told me my mother's ways were old-fashioned, that she clung too tightly, that she would never understand the demands of the life we were building. And I, blinded by love or perhaps arrogance, began to agree. I called less, visited almost never, until my mother became a memory rather than a presence. But the truth is, she must have known. A mother always knows when her child is slipping away. I can only imagine her sitting alone in that little house, waiting for footsteps that never came, telling herself I was busy, telling herself I still loved her even as the silence stretched. She never accused me, never reproached me. Her silence was her shield, and I mistook it for strength when it was really heartbreak. Looking back, I see how the distance widened like a crack in glass. At first invisible, then spreading until nothing could hold it together. And Sophia stood on the other side of that crack, urging me forward, further away from the woman who had given me everything. It was pride, not love, that made me choose the glittering world over my mother's arms. And pride always demands payment. I just didn't know yet that the bill was already on its way. It happened so suddenly that I still cannot trace the exact moment where my empire began to crumble. Perhaps it was when the board suspended me under the weight of accusations I had long ignored. Perhaps it was when the fire broke out at the warehouse that carried the lifeblood of my business, turning millions in goods into ash and smoke. Or perhaps it was when the bank informed me with cold, practiced voices that my accounts had been frozen, leaving me to stare at balances that no longer belonged to me. The fall of a man is never just numbers. It is the silence of phones that used to ring endlessly, the sudden distance of friends who once begged for your company, the whispers in corridors where your name was once spoken with respect. Overnight, Maxwell, the unstoppable, the untouchable, became a cautionary tale. Sophia fainted when the doctor told her she might never bear children. She lay pale in the hospital bed, clutching my hand, her beauty dimmed by despair. And in her eyes I saw the unspoken accusation. Everything had begun to unravel after the night I turned my mother away. I tried to resist the thought. I told myself it was coincidence, a cruel twist of fate, a storm of bad luck. But the truth weighed heavier each day. Every deal failed. Every ally turned enemy. Every hope collapsed. And each time, in the back of my mind, I saw my mother in the rain, her frail body kneeling, her trembling voice calling down a curse I had earned. Sleep abandoned me. Night after night, I wandered the halls of the mansion, listening to Sophia's muffled sobs behind closed doors, hearing only the echo of my mother's prayer. I remembered the oranges rolling across the stone steps, the paper bags split open like my own life had become. And I knew then her words had taken root. The newspapers feasted on my downfall. Tycoons suspended amid allegations. Maxwell's fortune in flames. Once a king, now a beggar. I stopped reading, but the headlines found me in every whispered conversation, every turned head, every mocking glance. The neighbors who once bowed to me now looked through me. The staff shrank in fear of losing their jobs. And Sophia, her face once lit by ambition, looked at me now with disappointment so deep it felt like betrayal. I sat in my study one evening, whiskey untouched, staring at the empty ledger of my life. The thought came to me with a weight I could not ignore. I had built palaces of glass and stone, but I had destroyed the only foundation that mattered, a mother's love. And now that love had been withdrawn, replaced by a curse I could not escape, I realized then that if I was to survive, if I was to breathe again, I had to return. Not as a conqueror, not as a son wrapped in pride, but as a broken man, ready to beg for forgiveness at the feet of the woman who had given me everything. The decision was clear. The journey back to her would be the longest road I had ever walked. The night I told Sophia we had to leave the mansion, her face turned pale as marble. She had been raised among chandeliers and chauffeurs. The thought of stepping onto an old, crowded bus was humiliation itself. But what pride did I have left to protect? The cars had been repossessed, the staff had resigned, the gates to our estate locked with bank seals. Only one road remained, the road back to the woman I had abandoned. We packed what little we could carry into 2 worn bags. Sophia wore sunglasses to hide her swollen eyes, but there was no hiding the despair in her posture. At the terminal, people whispered, recognizing the fallen millionaire and his wife boarding like common strangers. I kept my head low, my heart heavy. The ride was long, the bus rattling with every mile, carrying me away from glass towers and into the valley of my shame. When we arrived at the village, I could hardly breathe. The streets were the same, narrow, dusty, lined with houses patched with tin and paint that peeled under the sun. I had once called this place a prison. Now it looked like a sanctuary. Sophia clutched my arm as we walked toward my mother's home. Each step was heavier than the last. The door was still the same faded blue I remembered painting for her years ago. I raised my hand to knock, but it trembled. Then the door opened slowly, and there she stood. Olivia, her hair grayer, her frame smaller, her eyes deeper with sorrow, but her presence was unchanged. For a moment we just stared at one another, silence speaking louder than words. Then, without pride, without pretense, I fell to my knees. Sophia followed, her sobs breaking the air. "Mother?" I choked, my forehead nearly touching the ground. I was blind. I was proud. I forgot who gave me life. Forgive me, please. I cannot go on without your mercy. Sophia clung to her skirt, weeping. I wronged you too. I hardened his heart. Forgive me also if you can. My mother stood still, her hands trembling at her sides. For a long time she said nothing. The silence burned hotter than fire. Tears stung my eyes, dripping into the dust at her feet. I thought she would turn us away again, and the thought nearly crushed me. Then she sighed, a sound like a door opening after years of rust. She bent down slowly, her hands touching my face with the gentleness I remembered from childhood. "Maxwell," she whispered, "the world can strip you of everything, but a mother's love cannot be erased. I cursed your pride, not your soul. Rise, my son. You are forgiven." I could not move at first. Relief and shame collided inside me. Sophia sobbed louder, clinging to my mother's hands as if they were a lifeline. My mother stroked her hair too, and though her lips trembled, she said, "If God has forgiven me my sins, who am I not to forgive you yours?" That moment broke me open. The storm inside me stilled. I knew I had been given a second chance. Undeserved, yet merciful. And it was then, just as her words of forgiveness settled in the air, that my phone buzzed in my pocket. A call. A known number. I hesitated, but answered. "Mr. Maxwell?" a voice said. "You've been acquitted. The charges have been dropped. There's an offer waiting for you, one that could change everything." I looked at my mother, at Sophia still kneeling, and I knew. Her forgiveness had opened the gates of heaven and earth. But I did not yet know that another miracle was on its way. The morning after my mother forgave me, I woke in her small house to the sound of birds instead of the hum of machinery or the whispers of servants. The bed was hard, the sheets rough, yet I slept deeper than I had in years. Forgiveness has a way of softening even the harshest pillow. When I walked into the kitchen, she was already awake, stirring porridge as if nothing had changed. Sophia sat nearby, her eyes still red but her hands folded, quiet as a schoolgirl in confession. It was in that moment that I realized I had not returned to wealth, but to life itself. My mother placed a bowl in front of me, the same way she had done when I was a child, and I felt tears burn my throat. No palace, no banquet, no gala had ever tasted so rich. And then, as if heaven itself wanted to mark the turning point, my phone rang. I expected another blow, another humiliation. Instead, it was the lawyer whose voice had haunted me for weeks. "Maxwell," he said, "your name has been cleared. The accusations were unfounded. You are free to return. In fact, there is a new position waiting for you at the international branch. They want you." I almost dropped the phone. After months of disgrace, this call came only a day after my mother's forgiveness. I looked at her, her hands folded in prayer, and I knew this was no coincidence. Sophia wept beside me, whispering, "The curse is lifted," but the miracles were not finished. Weeks later, after countless visits to doctors who had long declared her barren, Sophia fainted again. This time it was not from grief, but from life stirring inside her. She was pregnant. I held the test in trembling hands, unable to speak. She wept into my chest, her voice muffled by disbelief. "We thought we lost everything, Max. And now look." My mother, when told, simply smiled through tears. God restores what pride destroys, she said, but only after humility breaks the heart. She moved into our new home, a modest place in the city, nothing like the mansion we had once boasted of, but filled with warmth that no marble could match. I insisted she live with us, not as a guest, but as the pillar of our family. At night, I often stood by the window, staring at the lights of the city. I thought about how easily a man can mistake power for destiny, wealth for love, pride for strength. My mother's forgiveness had taught me otherwise. Sophia's pregnancy was proof that life gives second chances only when you are willing to kneel. But peace never lasts untouched. Just when I thought my story had reached its redemption, fate prepared another revelation. Because one evening, as Sophia and I returned from a doctor's appointment, we found a figure waiting at our door. A woman holding the hand of a young girl. Her face was familiar, painfully so. It was Grace, the first woman I had ever loved. And beside her stood a child with my eyes. The evening Grace appeared at my door. Time itself seemed to stop. The street lamps flickered weakly, casting her face half in shadow. But I knew those eyes instantly. They were the same eyes that once looked at me with fire and devotion, before ambition pulled me away and pride silenced the promises I had whispered to her years ago. And the girl beside her. She clutched a small satchel, her hair damp with evening mist, her gaze curious yet cautious. When she lifted her face toward me, I froze. She had my jawline, my eyes, the same stubbornness I carried as a child. My knees weakened under the truth that required no words. Maxwell, Grace began, her voice trembling. I wouldn't have come if it weren't for her. She deserves to know her father. Sophia stepped forward then, her hand tightening around mine, though her pulse was racing. She studied the girl in silence, then looked at me, waiting for the answer my heart already knew. My mouth went dry. Is she mine? I asked, though I knew the answer. Grace nodded slowly. The girl shifted her weight, clutching her mother's hand tighter. We invited them inside. The air was thick with tension, and my mother, sitting by the window knitting, lifted her head at the sound of unfamiliar footsteps. When Grace spoke the words, "This is your granddaughter," the yarn slipped from my mother's lap. Her lips moved in silent prayer before she whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for bringing truth, even when it wounds." I sat across from the girl, struggling to find words. "What's your name?" I asked softly. "Amelia," she said, her voice careful, almost rehearsed. I tried to smile, but guilt pressed against my chest. "Amelia, I didn't know." Grace's eyes filled with restrained anger. "You didn't want to know. When I told you I was carrying your child, you were too busy chasing Sophia, too busy proving yourself to the world. I raised her alone. I carried the weight you abandoned." Her words cut deeper than any scandal I had endured. Sophia sat silently, her face pale, yet she didn't rise to defend herself or condemn me. She simply turned to Amelia and said gently, "Are you hungry, dear?" The girl nodded, and Sophia walked to the kitchen, her hands trembling but her voice steady. The hours that followed were heavy with confession and silence. Grace revealed the years of struggle, working 2 jobs, hiding Amelia's paternity to protect her from whispers, watching from afar as my name filled newspapers while she lived in shadows. Amelia sat quietly, tracing the rim of her cup with her finger, listening but not fully understanding the storm that surrounded her. When they finally stood to leave, Amelia looked at me one last time. Her eyes did not carry hatred, only an unspoken question. Would I be a father now, or would I vanish again? That night, sleep abandoned me. I stared at the ceiling, hearing Grace's words, seeing Amelia's eyes, feeling the weight of a past I thought I had buried. I had begged forgiveness from my mother, sought mercy from God, but now a new debt had been laid before me. One I could never repay with wealth, only with presence. And as dawn broke, I knew the next chapter of my life would not be written by contracts or positions. It would be written in the fragile bond between a man who had once failed and a daughter who had just found him. But how Sophia would face this truth, that was a storm waiting to break. The morning after Grace's visit, the house felt different. Sophia moved quietly, her eyes heavy but her steps deliberate, as if she had already decided not to let jealousy poison what was fragile and new. My mother, however, seemed almost relieved, as though Amelia's presence was a missing thread finally woven back into the family's torn fabric. She prayed longer than usual that morning, her voice soft but steady. Lord, teach us to widen the circle of love, even when it hurts. By noon, Grace returned with Amelia. I braced myself for Sophia's reaction, but to my surprise, she welcomed them not with suspicion but with an open table. She placed bread and fruit before Amelia, speaking gently, as if the girl had always belonged here. Amelia's guarded eyes softened a little when Sophia asked her about school, about her favorite books, about the games she liked to play. For a moment, I saw something I had not expected. Compassion from the woman who once urged me to send my own mother away. Grace sat across from me, her expression unreadable. She doesn't need money, Maxwell, she said firmly. She needs to know you won't vanish again. Can you give her that? I swallowed hard, glancing at Amelia. I can. I must. But I will not destroy what I've built with Sophia either. If I take my daughter into my life, it will be with honesty, not betrayal. Sophia placed her hand over mine then, her eyes moist but unwavering. I will not push her away. She is your daughter, and if she is yours, she is ours. I may not have given birth yet, but perhaps God has sent us another child to love before he grants me one of my own. Grace blinked, stunned by Sophia's words. For a while, silence filled the room, broken only by Amelia's small laughter as my mother taught her how to peel an orange without breaking the skin. The sound was pure, untouched by bitterness, and it pierced through all our defenses. Later that evening, Amelia sat beside me on the porch. Her legs swung off the step, her small hands folded in her lap. "Do you really want me here?" she asked softly. The question broke me. "Yes," I whispered, my throat thick. "I want you here more than anything. I should have been here from the beginning. I failed you once, Amelia. I won't fail you again." She studied me, her eyes older than her years. Then, without a word, she leaned against my shoulder. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. That night, as the house settled into uneasy peace, I lay awake beside Sophia, her hand resting on her stomach as if she could already feel the life stirring there. "We can make this work," she murmured in the dark, "but only if we choose love over pride." I kissed her forehead, knowing she was right. Grace's presence would not be simple. Amelia's arrival would not erase the past. But in their faces I saw a second chance, not just for me but for all of us. And I also knew this truth. When life grants you a second chance, it tests whether you have truly changed. The test had just begun. The weeks that followed Amelia's arrival reshaped my life more than all the years of wealth ever had. For the first time, our home was not a place of status but of voices. My mother's prayers at dawn, Sophia's steady counsel, Amelia's laughter echoing through rooms that once felt hollow. It was fragile, yes, stitched together by forgiveness rather than perfection, but it was real. One morning, I accompanied Sophia to a women's conference. She had been invited to speak, though she nearly refused, fearful that whispers of my downfall and Amelia's sudden appearance would cloud her words. But I urged her to go, and when she finally stepped onto that stage, I saw a woman I had never truly seen before. Her voice did not tremble. "I thought wealth would shield me from pain," she began. "But I learned that the true measure of a family is not in what it owns but in what it survives. Love is not flawless. It requires forgiveness, patience, and a strength greater than pride. And today, I stand not as a perfect wife or mother, but as a woman who has learned to love again." The hall erupted in applause. Tears streamed down my face as I watched her. She had carried the shame of my mistakes, but now she stood in her own light. Later, as we drove home, she held my hand and whispered, "That was for me, but also for us. We are not broken anymore. We are becoming something new." Inspired by her courage, I made a decision that night. I gathered my old contacts, investors who still respected my vision, and announced the birth of a foundation dedicated to mothers who sacrificed everything and to children whose dreams were smothered by poverty. I named it after my mother, Olivia. When I presented it to her, she pressed my hand, tears shining in her clouded eyes. Maxwell, this is the wealth I prayed you would find. Grace, too, began to change. Though still cautious, she allowed Amelia to spend weekends with us. Slowly, she stopped looking at me with bitterness and started to see the effort I made. Amelia herself bloomed. She read stories to my mother in the evenings, painted with Sophia on Sundays, and asked me to help her with her school projects. Each time she called me Dad. The wound of the years we lost healed just a little more. It was not easy. There were days of tension, of unspoken fears, of old scars that rose like shadows. Yet every time, love pushed back against pride, and little by little we grew into a family. One evening, I stood on the porch as the sun set, Amelia chasing fireflies in the yard, Sophia humming softly from the kitchen, and my mother rocking slowly in her chair. For the first time, I felt no hunger for skyscrapers, no envy of men with more. My kingdom was here, fragile but alive. And yet, as perfect as that moment seemed, I knew our story was not finished. Because the greatest test of love is not in quiet evenings but in the legacy we leave behind. And that test was waiting for us at my mother's 70th birthday. The day of my mother's 70th birthday dawned clear and bright, the kind of morning that seemed written in heaven. We had chosen to celebrate in the village where everything began, in the same place where I once felt trapped by poverty but which now stood as the soil of my redemption. Neighbors, old friends, even strangers filled the courtyard. There were no marble floors, no chandeliers, no flashing cameras. Only laughter, the smell of roasted bread, and the sound of children running free. I stood at the entrance of the house, watching my mother as she stepped outside. She wore a simple dress of deep blue, her silver hair braided neatly, her smile glowing as though time itself had bowed to her dignity. Amelia clung to her hand, chattering about school, while Sophia walked beside her, visibly radiant with her swelling belly. Grace was there too, quieter, her eyes soft as she watched her daughter finally have what she deserved, a family. When it came time for speeches, I rose, my voice steady though my heart trembled. This woman, I said, pointing to my mother, worked her hands raw so I could stand here today. She gave me everything while I gave her nothing but silence. And yet, when I returned broken, she forgave me. Mother, your love rebuilt me. Without you, I would not be a man. Without you, there would be no family, no legacy. Today we honor you, not for 70 years of life, but for 70 years of sacrifice and love. Sophia then stood beside me, her voice carrying across the crowd. When I married Maxwell, I thought wealth was all that mattered. But this woman taught me that true wealth is measured in love. Today I call her not only my mother-in-law, but my mother. She placed my mother's hand over her pregnant belly, and there were tears everywhere in the yard. The moment that undid me, however, came from Amelia. She stepped forward shyly, holding a piece of paper. Grandma Olivia, she read, her voice small but clear. Thank you for forgiving my dad, because if you didn't, I wouldn't have a family today. I promise to love you forever. My mother pulled her into an embrace so tender that silence fell, broken only by the sobs of those who witnessed it. That evening, as the sun dipped low, the children played in the yard. Amelia, the unborn child stirring within Sophia, and even the laughter of village boys who joined in freely. Grace stood with Sophia, speaking not as rivals but as women who had both loved, lost, and found their own kind of strength. My mother sat in her chair, her eyes closed, her face lifted toward the last golden rays of the day. I looked around me, at the family I once nearly destroyed, at the home that had forgiven me, at the legacy that was no longer measured by money but by love, and I finally understood. True wealth was not in the empire I once commanded. It was here, in the fragile, stubborn, miraculous bond of forgiveness and family. And as the first stars pierced the night sky, I knew one thing with certainty. When I leave this world, I will not be remembered for what I built or bought, but for the love I finally learned to give. That alone will be my legacy.